Hi everyone, and welcome back to our second lecture on Chapter 1 of Introduction to Human Geography. We finished off the first lecture on some of the ways we can describe where we are on Earth, and we're continuing on to the idea of regions. Our textbook uses fairly clear definitions to explain formal and functional regions, and then it introduces the idea of vernacular regions, but really as almost a subset of functional regions, which I don't think is quite right. And so I'm going to teach it the way I understand it and the way I like it. It makes sense to me, and I think most people that I talk about geography in this regard agree on this, which is a vernacular region is a special kind of region that's different from a formal or a functional region. And so we're going to define it as such, not as a subset of one of these two. The textbook also equivocates a little bit about formal and functional regions. I'm going to be much more clear about the difference between them, and so that's going to be a point of distinction that this lecture is meant to help instead of the textbook being a little bit fuzzy about. A formal region is an area of land that has at least one feature uniformly throughout it. So the term our textbook uses for that is homogeneous. There's some kind of a homogeneous thing. The feature could be a human feature or it could be a physical feature, but there's at least one feature uniformly throughout it. Because of that, so the definition is one thing everywhere inside of it, and then nowhere outside of it, a formal region has a clear boundary. It's not the boundaries that define the region, though. It is the thing that's inside of it that define the region. Let's take a look at an example. And that is the United States of America itself is a formal region, and the individual constituent states of the United States of America, for example, California here is highlighted, is a formal region. The thing that makes these formal regions is that everywhere inside of the region and nowhere outside of the region, each state has state law that applies everywhere inside and nowhere outside of the state's boundaries. So California state law applies in California and not in Nevada, not in Arizona, not in Oregon, for example. The United States has a national law, federal law, that applies everywhere inside of its borders and nowhere outside of its borders. Now, you can always find a little bit of wiggle room on this kind of thing because, of course, there are federal laws that apply to United States citizens even when they're traveling outside of the borders, but that's a little bit different. We're not talking about the actual region anymore, right? So if I travel to Mexico, the overwhelming bulk of federal law in the United States doesn't apply to me anymore while I'm in Mexico, or similarly, if I was in Canada, instead, Mexican law would apply to me while I was in that country, or Canadian law would apply to me there. Similarly, if I am in Washington State, Washington State law applies to me here, and Oregon or Idaho State law does not. But if I leave Washington State, then suddenly I'm under the jurisdiction of Oregon or Idaho State law. So these regions have these well-defined boundaries because the state law applies everywhere inside the region and nowhere outside of it, and therefore there is a clearly defined line that makes the edge of the region easy to see. But again, and this is a little bit of I'm putting a little bit of a fine point on this, but it's important to understand it's not just any line you draw makes a region, it's that the region has the same thing inside of it everywhere you go. Let me give another quick example of a formal region, and I'm actually going to pull up a map here. This is an example of a formal region of a lake. So the lake has the same thing everywhere inside of it, that is water, and nowhere outside of it, so land. It has a clear boundary because no one drew a line saying the lake is here. That's where the thing that is continuously everywhere inside of it stops being everywhere inside of it and stops being water and starts being land. So that's a physical formal region. You can have other kinds of physical formal regions that are a little less continuous seeming, but for example, some people define deserts as areas that receive less than a certain amount of rainfall. Other people define highlands as being above a certain elevation. And so you could imagine drawing a map of an area that has both those characteristics, either a highland or a desert in that case. Those are formal regions. They're easy to understand because they're fairly straightforward that way. Functional regions are regions that are defined by their utility or their usefulness. And there's a central point to a formal region, usually a place, right? But it could be bigger than a place, but still, thought of as a place like a city. And the thing that's different about a functional region is that unlike a formal region, it has a fuzzy boundary or a fuzzy border. And that's because the thing that's at the center is the most influential over things that are close to it, and the farther away you get from it, the less influential or less important it is. It's easy to understand with a few different examples. In the case of our textbook, they give us the Atlanta Metropolitan Statistical Area, or if you want to shorthand that, you could say the Atlanta Metro. So Metro Atlanta is much larger than the city of Atlanta itself. As a matter of fact, we could look at the city limits of Atlanta and say, this is a formal region that's the city of Atlanta. But the Metropolitan Statistical Area is all of the area around Atlanta that has a high degree of communication, people moving in and out, goods and services moving in and out of the city with the core city. So we've got this node of urban Atlanta here in the middle, and then the areas around it have a high degree of interaction with that node. Now, these counties that are farther away probably have a lot less interaction on average than the ones that are right next to it, right? And so that's telling us that this functional region, the function's at the middle, it's the city, and as you move further and further away from the city, it becomes relatively less important, and eventually it becomes even less important, but it just fades. It's not like there's a dividing line where Atlanta is relevant and then it's no longer relevant. So what is at the center of a metropolitan statistical area? Well, a city. And when we talk about interaction with the city or exchange with the city, we're talking about the flow of people into and out of the city. So everything from maybe people go there to watch a sporting event, right? Maybe people go there to see a show, go to a movie even, although there's probably movies elsewhere as well. But people go into the city for recreation, is one of the things I'm naming here too. People go into the city for business. People probably go into the city for services like medical care. And so all of those draws will pull people from the surrounding area into the city. Now, the farther away you live, all other things being equal except for the distance, the farther away you live, the less likely you are to interact with downtown Atlanta. And the closer you live, the more likely you are to interact. So that's why we're talking about this functional region being a little bit more vague. We agree it exists. Atlanta is a place, and the greater Atlanta metro area is also a place, or a region in this case. But exactly where we draw those borders can vary a little bit based on how much influence we decide we're going to think of it as important, right? Now, let me do a really quick example of this functional region with an example, and we're going to center on Auburn here. But what I want to talk about, and this is an idea of economic geography, but we're going to look at market areas. That is the area served by a particular business. And I'm going to type in here Starbucks. And I'm going to look for locations for Starbucks. And what we observe is that if we look at a business like Starbucks, Starbucks has a lot of, and I'm not sure why it's showing it up here and not down here where I tried to center the map, but we're gonna, I want to do it right here. I know there's Starbucks down here. Why? I don't know why it's doing that. It's a little confusing to me. I'm going to search again one more time. There we go. What we observe about the pattern of Starbucks is that Starbucks are actually fairly closely clustered. As a matter of fact, it's not uncommon to have one inside of a store and then one have it as a standalone. And we see that happening in a lot of these places. But here's 4 Starbucks all within, I don't know, half a mile of each other there in Federal Way. A couple Starbucks here. So the pattern we observe of Starbucks is there's quite a few of them in this landscape. And that tells us that the market area of each Starbucks is relatively small. So if you drew a line or a circle around these, you'd imagine that people aren't going to drive for 20 minutes to get to a Starbucks. They might drive for 5 minutes to get to a Starbucks. So there needs to be a lot of different locations to be close to a lot of different people. And so Starbucks is achieving that by having lots of different shops. Now, of course, we're not looking at other coffee shops here, just at Starbucks, but this gives us this idea that the market area of this Starbucks is probably right around here. And as we move farther away from it, it becomes less influential because people don't want to drive all the way there. People probably drive from Lee Hill. I know people drive, as a matter of fact, from campus, from Green River campus right here, down to that Starbucks. But there's probably an area of influence around it here. And then once you start getting over this way, maybe you're halfway between, maybe you have a reason to go to one or the other, but it's less clear which Starbucks customer you might be, right? So it's not a definite line. It's not clearly defined like we would see with a formal region, but we just have this idea that the further away you get from a Starbucks, the less likely you are to go there, and maybe you're more likely to go to a competitor or more likely to go to a different Starbucks. If we look at another example here, and we'll look at Fred Meyer, see locations. Now, people will travel farther for a Fred Meyer, and we observe a nice even distribution of these Fred Meyers across the landscape. So there's one over here, there's one right here in Auburn, there's another one over here towards Maple Valley, there's one in Covington, there's one up in Kent, up on the East Hill, there's one down here. I don't know if this is officially called Des Moines or not, but it's close to Des Moines. You get the idea. There's this nice even distribution of them, almost like they're laid out on a grid, but not quite. And what that's doing is telling us is that the market area, the functional region of that Fred Meyer is much larger than the functional region of a Starbucks. So the people traveling to a Fred Meyer to buy their groceries or department store kind of goods that you buy at a Fred Meyer will drive maybe 20 minutes, maybe even 30 minutes to get to a Fred Meyer where they wouldn't for a coffee. And so Fred Meyer's locations are based on that idea that these market areas, so the Auburn market area probably draws around right here, and then the Des Moines one, if that is Des Moines, I'm not sure if that's considered Kent or Des Moines, but you'll have to forgive me for my lack of geographic knowledge on that one. And then you can imagine Federal Way, this Fred Meyer's capturing all these folks over here. So there's a zone in between that's not exactly clear whose Fred Meyer someone belongs to, or which Fred Meyer someone belongs to, but that's the nature of a functional region. These boundaries are fuzzy and a little bit less clearly defined because the center point has the most influence, and as you move away from it, it's less influential. So there's a few different examples of a functional region. The last kind of region, this is mentioned in the text and as a little bit of an aside, and I want to really explain it more clearly. A vernacular region is a region that we refer to, and vernacular means just of common speech. We'll just talk about a thing, right? And the definition, though, when we think about it, isn't always as clear as we might like it to be. It's something that we have defined through custom or culture or folk wisdom. There's not a clear definition written down in the dictionary necessarily. Or even if it is written in the dictionary, not everyone agrees with that definition. These regions are also known as perceptual regions because they exist in our minds. We agree that there's such a place, but then exactly where it is a little bit different for a lot of different people's perceptions. The classic example of a vernacular region in the United States is the American South. And here I want to present this interesting graphic from the 538 blog. It uses SurveyMonkey data, but I think they made their own map, and so that's why the attribution goes to Allison McCann at 538. The question was, which states do you consider part of the South? And they asked people who identified as somewhat a Southerner or a lot a Southerner. So these are people who had self-identified as Southerners, and they said, okay, which states are the South then? And this is where it gets interesting, is that people said all the way out to Arizona, some people, not a lot, but some people said all the way out to Arizona and Colorado, up to Ohio and Pennsylvania as Southern, right? Like, north of Ohio, that's Canada, folks, but still, the idea of the South is very much a perceptual idea, and it's in people's idea of what South is, not necessarily a formal definition. And then notice that California, nobody thinks of California as the South, even though it's on the southern US border, right? Because we're actually not talking about the compass direction here. We're talking about the idea of southern states. So you can see some interesting patterns here. There's a core stripe here of southern states from Louisiana to Georgia, including Mississippi and Alabama. Notice that Florida is considered a little less southern, even though it's farther south than Georgia or Alabama, right? And so this is a good example of a vernacular region. The South exists. Nobody will tell you that the South doesn't exist, but exactly what the South is a little different in everybody's head. And so that's what we're talking about here. Now, why isn't it a formal region? Well, if we talked about the states of the Confederacy, that is the states that fought against the Union in the Civil War, then that would be a formal region. But that's not what we mean necessarily. Some people maybe, but not necessarily what everyone means when they say the South. They might be talking about the food people eat, or people's social customs, or something else. People's accents, for example. People talk about Southern accent, right? And so the places where people say y'all a lot is a slightly different map than the former Confederacy. So these ideas of a vernacular region aren't formally defined. It's not a formal region. It's not a functional region either, because there's no central node. Even though there's sort of a center of the map here in these 4 states, there's not something that is like the most southern that diffuses away or weakens as you move away from those. It's just that is what it is. Similarly, but not as much of a vernacular region, just in terms of popularity, is the Northwest. Some people, if they drew a line around the Northwest, would draw it just around the corner of Washington State up here. Other people would draw it so that it includes western Montana, northern Idaho, and Oregon, right? Depends on who you ask and what they think of as Northwestern. All right, let's move on to geographic data gathering and analysis. Now, first thing I always tell my students, if they're interested in geography and they like the idea of learning more geography, I say, if you like geography and you also want to have a job that pays you well, then you should study this kind of thing, the tools of geography. You want to study remote sensing as part of that, probably, but especially geographic information systems. So remote sensing is just how we get the data, how we find out about the Earth. In this case, we've got a satellite image of deforestation, I believe in the Amazon, but I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But we can map things like deforestation through visual means like satellite photography. We can also use remotely sensed wavelengths that are not visible. In this case, thermal imaging, so we can see the different temperatures of surfaces in a city and make a model of that and realize where there's heat being gained and where the city could use some cooling and why it's so hot in cities. We can do all kinds of really amazing science by looking at things from a distance. That's called remote sensing. Now, a geographic information system is where the real power of geography comes to play and has all kinds of applications. It used to be that when you draw a map, you draw it on paper, and then if you were doing really complex mapping or planning, you would draw it on sheets of transparent acetate. It was a clear film, and then you would take the layers of the clear film and lay them on top of each other, and there'd be different features on each one, and you're seeing that here, these data layers, but you'd layer them on top of each other and look through it and try and see through the whole map. Now a GIS will do that for you in a computer, And it's an amazingly powerful thing to be able to do this. So you can look at, here we've got streets and buildings and vegetation. And so with just this information, you could say, I want to find a parcel of land that is near a street, that's not near a swamp and doesn't have any buildings on it. And the GIS will compute that, and it will highlight all the areas of land that meet those criteria you specified. That was a really simple example. GISs can be incredibly complex and used to solve massive problems. Everything from power grid modeling to help power companies make sure that if a part of the grid goes down, that power is routed to serve the most customers it can. If power goes down, they can pinpoint where the outage was likely to have occurred, so they can send a crew to it. GISs are run to help with ambulance and police and fire dispatch, for example. All this stuff, anything you can imagine that has a spatial component to it, there is probably some GIS-backed application working on it. So it's pretty impressive. A quick example from our textbook is that of crime mapping. And so this is used a lot in criminal justice and law enforcement kind of planning, especially around law enforcement. So crime mapping, in this case, we're looking at homicides in Washington, D.C. over a 2-year period. And we can, without doing too much inference here, we notice some pretty clear patterns, right? So first of all, we notice that the northwestern side of the city is relatively free of homicides. And then we notice a few clusters. There's a cluster here, and maybe a couple clusters here. And in particular, it seems like there's some banding here, right? So there's a major road, it looks like here to me, and there's a bunch of homicides along that. And then I notice a couple, sort of a stripe out this way and a stripe out that way. So I don't know the geography of Washington, D.C. at all, but this is a kind of a map that might help someone figure out if there are any patterns to homicide and try and address the problem in a way that it lessens the total number of homicides. So it's a laudable goal if it achieves that aim. Moving on, we can now talk about differences between places and how those changes take place over time. Our book goes through 2 kinds of diffusion. I'm going to introduce a third because I think it's important. Relocation diffusion and expansion diffusion are 2 ways that ideas or things, including people, move from place to place. In relocation diffusion, what we see here is that people, in this case, get up and move. Now, it doesn't have to be people. It could be physical geography. It could be rocks on a hillside. But we really talk about relocation diffusion in human geography as people moving. And so relocation diffusion is migration, pure and simple in that context. And so we've got people that were over here, and then they all move up like this. Now, this is a little unrealistic because migrants don't all move all at once to the other side of a group. They tend to move a few at a time into a new place where there's others already there very often. But this is a pretty simple model of that happening, right? And then on the other hand, sometimes something spreads, but it doesn't spread by moving the original. So the point of relocation diffusion is that if this person is here at first and then they move, then they're here later and they're no longer where they came from. Expansion diffusion is when something spreads through a population or spreads across a landscape, but it doesn't leave the original point, it just grows in influence. So this is something, culture propagates this way. So something that's a fad could start out with one person and then spread to their friends and then spread to their friends' friends. And then before you know it, everybody's using that app or playing that game or saying that slang term, right? That would be an expansion diffusion of a cultural phenomenon. Or this is also the way diseases can spread, right? And so we saw that in real life with COVID-19, where someone would catch it and then they would spread it to the people who were sharing the same air in close contact for a certain amount of time. And then it spread through the population until, in the United States today, I think something like around 70% of the US population has had COVID-19 at least once, and some people more than once now. And so that's, this is showing everybody getting in. It's possible to skip, right? But this is a later stage of what we call expansion diffusion. One of the terms for this, by the way, is called contagious diffusion, where it spreads just to the people closest to you, and then the people closest to them get it, and et cetera, et cetera. A different form of expansion diffusion that I want to talk about, different than contagious, is what we call hierarchical diffusion. And a hierarchical diffusion is different than a contagious diffusion because it follows a hierarchy. And also very important to that is hierarchies don't always go both ways. So in this case, we've got a really generic chain of command from Wikipedia that is copied off Wikipedia because it was for public use. And here we've got a general at the top, colonels below, captains below that, sergeants, and then privates. And you can imagine that each captain would actually have sergeants, and each sergeant would have privates. So there would be much more troops down here than there would be commanding officers, right? Anyway, if the general makes an order and sends it to the colonels, then the colonels send it to the captains send it to the sergeants, and every single private gets it, right? So everybody, if the general says something, that it diffuses hierarchically through the entire organization, in this case, the entire army, right? But if a general says, you all can do it the way you want to, I don't care, you decide, and Colonel A decides to do a process one way, but Colonel B decides to do it a different way, then everyone under Colonel B's command adopts that practice, but not everyone under Colonel A's command adopts that practice. So it's possible then to have different divisions, in this case, adopting different practices because of that hierarchy, right? The sub-hierarchy below the general level, in this case, changing things a little bit, right? Or the same thing for at the sergeant level, right? It's possible that a sergeant might do something slightly different, and it doesn't happen to the whole army; it just happens to that unit, right? I'm not using the right terms. I know this. I'm not enough of a military person to know all the different organizational terms for the army. But importantly, this is hierarchical from the top down, and so it doesn't matter if an enlisted member then has an idea and tells the sergeant. As a matter of fact, it's likely to backfire. And likewise, the sergeant can't tell the colonel what to do, right? So it comes top down, but it doesn't go bottom up. Now, in a lot of really large firms, like, for example, Boeing, there's a really strong hierarchical organization, but they've realized that a chain of command is really good for some things like keeping discipline in the military. But it's also stifling because it stifles innovation. It could be that somebody working at a low level but doing important stuff might have an innovation that could save the company a lot of money. But if they're just following the orders of the hierarchy, then there's no incentive to innovate. And so a lot of firms have realized that hierarchical diffusion, if it's not allowed to trickle back up, if innovation can't trickle back up, then it's not going to result in innovation throughout the company. It won't result in innovation that results in sort of competition and profit. And so a lot of companies have recognized that hierarchies are stifling to different processes that they want to see rewarded. And so they do things to reward people for basically not necessarily upsetting the hierarchy, but at least like going to a few levels higher and sharing their thoughts in a way that might influence more of that hierarchy. So that's one more example of how diffusion can happen. In geography, we observe this happen in all kinds of hierarchical organizations. So for example, religious organizations are very often hierarchical. The Catholic Church is famously hierarchical. Not every religion is as hierarchical, but that's one example. All right, this is our last theme, and I'm going to take a little bit of time on this, but not too much time. I'll check my time here. We're about half an hour in right now, so let's talk about our last thing, and hopefully not take too long. The human-environment relationship is what we call this in our textbook. Another term you may hear for this, and I think is a valuable one to know in case you hear it again, is cultural ecology. What is cultural ecology? Well, it's just meaning the relationships between humans and their environment, right? Culture, of course, is the things that humans do and the things we believe and the way we behave. And ecology is the way natural systems interact with one another, including biotic and abiotic components. So the environment, and so humans interacting with their environment, the fancy word for that is cultural ecology. There you have it. All right. So these two theories of cultural ecology, or two approaches to human-environment relationships, are environmental determinism and possibilism. Environmental determinism has a poor history, and so it's people are really appropriately skeptical of environmental deterministic explanations. Possibilism is a much more open-minded and usually a very strong explanation for much of what we observe about culture. I'm going to make sure that we circle back to the divide between these two things, because sometimes you'll run into a geography textbook that says, we just don't do that one anymore for environmental determinism, but that's not really fair to thinking about the human-environment relationship. So let's talk about environmental determinism first. The environmental determinist idea is that culture is caused by the environment in which it is embedded. So in other words, when you go to an island in the tropics and you observe the features of that culture, the way people behave, the way people have families, the way people prepare their food, the way they speak, the way they learn, the way they teach their kids, everything about that culture. And if it's different, which it always is if you travel someplace different, right? There's different cultures in different places. If you say, oh, these people have a very distinctive culture, and it must be because they are here on this island. This island caused their culture. That is an environmental deterministic statement to make. It used to be excessively common. It was used to excuse all kinds of colonial thought, racist thought. It was used to justify everything up to and including enslavement of Africans, for example, because the argument was, well, the colonizer's society, of course, being ethnocentric, was superior, and then the colonized society was inferior from their ethnocentric standpoint. And so, of course, it was justified by that superiority-inferiority belief, but also rationalized by the environment. So a lot of European colonial powers argued that because Europe had a place where the winters were cold and long, and you needed to farm really hard in the summer so you could save food for the winter, and that was a different lifestyle than the tropics, where the food just literally grew on the trees all year round. And so that created a different culture, but not different, just different, but from the European colonial perspective, they thought it was better. And that justified doing all kinds of terrible things to subjugate tropical peoples, right? Including colonizing them, taking their resources, and enslaving some of them. So that's a bit of the history of environmental determinism, which is clearly not good, right? And so people really moved away from that for good reason. And the place that they really went to was with the idea of possibilism. And possibilism is the idea that there are many different cultural responses to any particular environmental condition. If that's a lot to unpack, let me give you some examples. For example, let's say it's too hot. One thing that I can do to adapt my culture, my response to that too hot out condition, is I could take a siesta. I could rest in the afternoon. I could close down my shop. I could stop working in the field. I could stop doing whatever my job is. I stop doing my job at around 1 o'clock when it's the hottest time of the day. And then I come back to work at around 3 or maybe even 3:30 when it's starting to cool off a little bit. And then I work later in the evening. And then I have a really late dinner, maybe at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock when it's cool, finally. If that sounds unusual to you, that's because you're probably not familiar with Spanish siesta culture. In most places in Spain, especially southern Spain, that is quite common to do that. And if you're in a small town that's not really a tourist town, you'll see virtually the entire town shuts down for a couple hours in the afternoon. Maybe not quite as much in winter, but especially in summer. That's their way of dealing with it being too hot. Now, that's one way of a culture dealing with it being too hot. Another way of a culture dealing with it being too hot is to turn up the air conditioning. That's what most cities in the United States deal with heat by doing. They just crank up the AC, right? And that's way less flexible than a siesta, right? It's just we're going to make sure that it's cold inside our buildings, but it's another way of doing it. You could also, if it's too hot, you could change the way you recreate, and you would, instead of going for a run, you would go to the beach, for example, right? So that's a cultural response to an environmental condition, right? The other thing you could do if it's too hot, and this is becoming a bigger issue as the climate warms on Earth, is you could move. You could move to a place where it's not as hot. That's unlikely to be a big driver for people who are working and living in cities, although it may be eventually, but they're probably likely to get AC. It's probably going to happen first. But that's a huge driver if you're a farmer. And so if you rely on adequate rainfall and moderate temperatures, not too hot temperatures, and suddenly the temperatures are just too hot, then you don't have much choice. And so your cultural response to that is neither take a siesta or turn up the AC. Your cultural response is to move to some place where there's more rain. So the point of possibilism is to point out that humans are, by definition, incredibly resourceful. And we are incredibly resourceful to the point where we will change our environment to suit our needs if we need to, or we'll adapt to it. But the ways in which we adapt to our environment are not predetermined by that environment. That's the beauty about culture, about this possibilist approach, is that we have many different possibilities in any given environment. So where does that leave us? The challenge here is that we went from this idea of the culture that we see is caused by the environment in which it is based to anything is possible. And the problem with that is that as bad as environmental determinism was in terms of being overly simplistic and overly applied, and applied with prejudice too, right, was part of the problem. It is still useful for us to understand, because we also have to acknowledge that the environment does set limits on human activity. So we're not going to have a beach resort in Antarctica anytime soon, even though we could build one. It would be silly to build one when we have so much sun and sand elsewhere on Earth, right? So recognizing that that even if human ingenuity is such that we can put somebody on the moon and maybe even somebody on Mars before long here, even though we have this sort of seemingly limitless number of possibilities, there are practical limitations that the environment sets for us. And so recognizing that the environment does set limits, and that our ability to adjust or adapt to them is great, but not infinite, is really important. Our book gives a couple examples of this, and one is wildfires, which is that we see people living in wildfire zones and not really being ready for that. So the wildfire determined that they didn't have a place to live. It burnt up their houses, right? And that's a reality in the American West today that we haven't really possibilized our way out of yet, and it will be very expensive to do so if we ever do. The other example that the textbook gives, I believe, is of tsunamis. And again, tsunamis are environmental disasters that people can try and prepare for and can do a lot to prepare for, but also are incredibly devastating. And we don't have a tsunami-proof society anywhere yet. So that's a couple ways of thinking about the role the environment still plays in the way we live and how we live and what we do. That is all for now. I believe that's my last slide. It is. I hope that was a useful introduction to geography. I know that some of the concepts are a little dry here and there, but I hope the examples help give you some things to hold on to that are more interesting. And we'll keep it going into chapter 2. I really get excited in chapter 2, so I hope you stay with me and keep enjoying geography with me. Thanks so much. That's all for now.